to communicate on the call were the following. Quote, looked forward to seeing President Zelensky really implement the agenda on which he had run related to anti-corruption reforms. That's correct.
That is, yes.
And Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, would you agree that this focus on anti-corruption is a critical aspect of our policy towards Ukraine?
I would.
And Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you are aware that in 2014, during the Obama administration, the first anti-corruption investigation partnered between the U.S., the U.K., and Ukraine was into the owner of the company Burisma.
I'm aware of it now.
And Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you testified that you were aware that Burisma had questionable business dealings. That's part of its track record.
That is correct.
You also testified that regarding Burisma, money laundering, tax evasion comports with your understanding of how business is done in Ukraine. Is that correct?
I'm not aware of specific incidents, but my understanding is that it would not be out of the realm of the possible for Burisma.
Well, that's page 207 from your testimony, but I'll move on. You are aware that Hunter Biden did sit on the board of Burisma at this time?
I am.
Well, I know that my constituents in New York 21 have many concerns about the fact that Hunter Biden, the son of the vice president, sat on the board of a corrupt company like Burisma. The Obama administration, State Department, was also concerned, and yet Adam Schiff refuses to allow this committee to call Hunter Biden despite our requests. Every witness who has testified and has been asked this has answered yes. Do you agree that Hunter Biden on the board of Burisma has the potential for the appearance of a conflict of interest?
Certainly the potential, yes.
And Ms. Williams?
Yes.
Now, shifting to the legal requirements that our aid to Ukraine is conditioned on anti-corruption. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you testified that you understood that Congress had passed, under the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative, a legal obligation to certify that corruption is being addressed.
That is correct.
And you also testified that it is required by the National Defense Authorization Act.
That is correct.
So for the public listening, we are not just talking about President Trump focusing on anti-corruption in Ukraine, but it is so critical, so important that hard-earned taxpayer dollars, when given to foreign nations, that by law, overwhelmingly bipartisan support requires anti-corruption in Ukraine in order to get U.S. taxpayer-funded aid. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you spoke extensively about the importance of defensive lethal aid to Ukraine, specifically javelins. This was in your deposition.
Correct.
And you testified that the Javelin in particular, because of its effectiveness in terms of influencing the Russian decision calculus for aggression, it is one of the most important tools we have when it comes to providing defensive lethal aid.
The system itself and the signaling of U.S. support, yes.
And it is a fact that that aid was provided under President Trump and not President Obama.
That is correct.
And my last question, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I know you serve at the NSC in the White House. I served in the West Wing of the White House for President Bush on the Domestic Policy Council and in the Chief of Staff's office, so I'm very familiar with the policy process. I also know that as a staff member, the person who sets the policy of the United States is the president, not the staff. And you testified that the president sets the policy, correct?
That is correct.
And I respect your deep expertise, your tremendous service to our country. We can never repay those that have worn the military uniform and served our nation. But I was struck when you testified in your deposition. I would say, first of all, I'm the director for Ukraine. I'm responsible for Ukraine. I'm the most knowledgeable. I'm the authority for Ukraine, for the National Security Council and the White House. I just want a clarification. You report to Tim Morrison, correct?
In my
Your
advisory
direct report is Tim Morrison,
in
correct?
my advisory, just to clarify, only in my advisory capacity, I advise up through the chain of command. That's what I do.
And the chain of command is Tim Morrison to Ambassador John Bolton, the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And do you agree that the President sets the policy as Commander-in-Chief, as you testified previously?
Absolutely.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you both. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I think the follow-up question that my colleague from New York did not ask you, but is relevant for everyone at home. Isn't it true that the Department of Defense had certified that the anti-corruption requirements of Ukraine had been met when the hold was put on by the president?
That is correct.
Now, Mr. Jordan suggested that the president did something none of us expected by releasing that call transcript. You listened to the call, is that right, Lieutenant Colonel?
That is.
Ms. Williams, you also listened to the call, is that right?
Yes.
Fair to say, Ms. Williams, a lot of other people at the White House listened to the call or read the transcript?
I can't characterize how many. I believe there were for 5 or 6 of us in the listening room at the time.
And the transcript was distributed to others, is that right?
I wasn't part of that process, but that's my understanding.
So the president is asking for us and his defenders to give him a gold star because a number of people listened to the call or saw the call transcript and then he released it. The difference, of course, between this and, say, his one-on-one meeting in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin was it was a one-on-one meeting, and he took the notes from the interpreter, so none of us could see it. The point being, the president had no choice but to release a call that everyone had seen. Now, you've been asked to also characterize what exactly legally all of this means. And Mr. Ratcliffe pointed out that no one had used the term bribery in our depositions. And Ms. Williams, you're not a lawyer, are you?
I'm not, no.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, are you a lawyer?
Lawyer's back there.
The lawyer's your brother, right?
Yeah.
Born 20 seconds after you, is that what you said?
9 minutes.
9 minutes after you, yes. You're the older brother.
Yeah. Lifetime of wisdom there.
Now, I want to give you a hypothetical here. Suppose you have a shooting victim and the police respond after the victim is doing a little bit better and they ask the victim, well, tell us what happened. And the victim says, well, someone came up to my car, shot into the car, hit me in the shoulder, hit me in the back, hit me in the neck. Miraculously, I survived, but I can identify, who the person is that pulled the trigger. And the police say, okay, you were shot, you know who it is, but shucks, you didn't tell us that this was an attempted murder, so we're going to have to let the person go. Is that how it works in our justice system, that unless victims or witnesses identify the legal theories of a case, we just let people off the hook? Is that how it works, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman?
I'm not an attorney, but it doesn't seem so.
I don't think your brother would think so either. Ms. Williams, Vice President Pence was described to our committee by Mr. Morrison as a, quote, voracious reader of his intelligence read book. And after the April 21 call with President Zelensky, you put a transcript of that call in the Vice President's read book. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then the Vice President called President Zelensky 2 days later. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you told us in the deposition that he stuck pretty faithfully to what President Trump had said in that April 21 call. Is that right?
I believe his remarks were consistent, but he also spoke on other issues as well, including anti-corruption.
And you would describe the Vice President as somebody who would make follow-up calls to world leaders after the President had done so. Is that right?
He has on occasion. It's not a normal practice. It depends on the situation.
And in that case, he stuck to President Trump's talking points.
I would say that I provided talking points for the April 23rd call for the Vice President, which included discussion of President Zelensky's inauguration, which President Trump had also discussed with President Zelensky. But I would say the Vice President discussed other issues with President Zelensky as well.
And as was stated earlier, the President sets the foreign policy for the United States. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And you told us that after the July 25 call between President Trump and President Zelensky, that you put the call transcript in Vice President Pence's intelligence briefing book. Is that right?
I ensured it was there. My colleagues prepared the book, but yes.
So let's flash forward to September 1. Vice President Pence meets with President Zelensky. Is that right?
That's correct.
You're there.
Yes.
And President Zelensky with Vice President Pence, they talk about a lot of things, but you will agree that Vice President Pence did not bring up the Bidens. Is that correct?
That's correct. He did not.
He did not bring up investigations.
No.
Is one reasonable explanation that although Vice President Pence will do a lot of things for President Trump, that he was not willing to bring up investigations in Biden's because he thought it was wrong?
I'm not in a position to speculate. We had not discussed those particular investigations in any of the preparatory sessions with the Vice President.
But you didn't bring it up with the Ukrainians after the July 25 call, right?
He did not in that meeting, no.
And you did not either.
No.
And Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, did you ever ask the Ukrainians to do what President Trump was asking them to do after the July 25 phone call?
I did not. I didn't render any opinion on what was asked in the 25.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Hurd.
Ms. Williams, I want to join my colleagues in thanking you for your service. We share a personal hero in Dr. Rice, so great minds think alike. Did you participate in or overhear any conversations about how potential information collected from the Ukrainians on the Bidens would be used for political gain?
No, I did not participate or overhear any conversations along those lines.
Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I think all of us would agree that your father made the right move to come here, and we're glad that he did. You've talked about how part of your responsibilities is developing talking points for your principals. Is that correct?
That is correct.
President, I'm assuming you also do that for your direct supervisor currently right now, Mr. Morrison. Is that correct?
Mr. Morrison has left the position some time ago already, at least 3 weeks ago.
But you prepare talking points for your supervisors. Is that correct?
Typically, frankly, at that level, they don't really take talking points, especially if they have expertise. The talking points are more intended for National Security Advisor, although Ambassador Bolton didn't really require him because of his deep expertise. It's the next level up. The president.
But traditionally, I'm just trying to establish that this position is somebody that creates talking points for a number of people. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do they always use them?
No.
Or is President Trump known to stick to a script?
I don't believe so.
So is it odd that he didn't use your talking points?
No, it is not.
In your deposition, if your lawyer wants to follow on, it's page 306. You were asked about events during the temporary holds on U.S. assistance to Ukraine. This is that 55-day period or so. And you testified that the U.S. administration did not receive any new assurances from Ukraine about anti-corruption efforts, and that the facts on the ground did not change before the hold was lifted. Is that accurate in recounting your testimony?
That is accurate.
When was President Zelensky sworn in?
He was sworn in on, May 20th, 2019.
And then he had a new parliament, too, elected after he was. Is that correct?
He did.
And when was that parliament seated?
That was July 21st, 2019.
That was when they won, right? They weren't properly seated until August.
That's right. That's when they won, and they weren't seated until August.
Your boss's boss, Ambassador Bolton, traveled to Ukraine in late August, right? August 27, 28. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did he take you with you? Did he take you with him?
He didn't.
We know from other witnesses that when Ambassador Bolton was there, he met with President Zelensky and his staff, and they talked about how they were visually exhausted, because one of the things that President Zelensky did during that time period was change the Ukrainian constitution to remove absolute immunity from Rada deputies, right? Some of their parliamentarians, because that had been the source of raw corruption for a number of years. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
Were you aware of this important change to Ukrainian law?
Of course. Yep.
And you don't believe that's a significant anti-corruption effort?
No, it is significant.
It's pretty significant, correct. Also, Ambassador Taylor testified that President Zelensky, with this new parliament, opened Ukraine's high anti-corruption court. Right, this had been an initiative that many folks and in our State Department had been pushing to happen, and that was established in that time frame. Were you aware of this?
Yes.
Do you think this is a significant anti-corruption?
I do.
When you talked about, how many times have you met President Zelensky?
I think it was just the one time from the presidential delegation, multiple engagements, but just the one trip.
And that's a one-on-one meeting?
That was in a larger bilateral format. Then there were a couple of smaller venues. They were all in. There was never a one-on-one, but there were a couple of again touch points. So the bilateral meeting, handshake, meet and greet. He had a short.
So there was a lot of people in the room.
Yeah.
When you met with them.
Yes,
but you still advised the Ukrainian president to watch out for the Russians.
Yes.
And and everybody else in the room, I'm assuming the National Security Advisor was there. I believe in this case, you had other members of the administration. Were your points pre-approved? Did they know you were going to bring up those points?
We did have a huddle beforehand, and it's possible I flagged them, but I don't recall specifically. It's possible I didn't.
And you counseled the Ukrainian president to stay out of U.S. politics?
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back the time I do not have.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Williams, thank you for your service to the country. Colonel Vindman, thank you for your service. And it's great to talk to a fellow identical twin. I hope that your brother's nicer to you than mine is to me. It doesn't make you grow a beard. You both listened in real time to the July 25th call. In particular, you would have heard President Trump ask the president of Ukraine, quote, "I'd like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike." And quote, "The server, they say Ukraine has it." This is a debunked conspiracy theory that has no basis in fact. President Trump's own former Homeland Security advisor, Thomas P. Bossert, called the president's assertion that Ukraine intervened in the 2016 elections, quote, "not only a conspiracy theory, but, quote unquote, completely debunked," unquote. Colonel Vindman, are you aware of any evidence to support the theory that the Ukrainian government interfered in the 2016 election?
Congressman, I am not, and furthermore, I would say that this is a Russian narrative that President Putin has promoted.
And are you aware of any part of the U.S. government, its foreign policy or intelligence apparatus that supports that theory?
No, I'm not aware of.
And you are aware that other parts of the U.S. government, our intelligence community, for example, has said definitively that it was the Russians who interfered in the 2016 elections?
That is correct.
It seems incredibly odd, though, unfortunately, but not inconsistent to me, that President Trump would be giving credence to a conspiracy theory about Ukraine that helps Russia really in at least two ways. First, it ignores and frankly undermines the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community and seeks to weaken a state dependent on the United States support to fight Russian aggression. It also, for the United States, hurts our national security and emboldens Russia. And I want to look at what President Trump was doing on his call instead of pushing back against Russian hostility. He was pressuring Ukraine to do his political work. President Trump stated on that July 25th call, quote, "There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me." Colonel Vindman, when you hear those words, do you hear the president requesting a thoughtful and well-calibrated anti-corruption program consistent with U.S. policy?
I do not.
In fact, it sounds like President Trump was encouraging the Ukrainian president to engage in precisely the same type of behavior for President Trump's own political benefit that we discourage foreign leaders from undertaking in their own countries. And discouraging other countries from undertaking politically motivated investigation is, in fact, a major part of official U.S. anti-corruption policy. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And are you, in fact, aware of any evidence that Vice President Biden improperly interfered in an investigation of his family members?
I am not.
These false narratives, it should be said, are damaging our country. They poison our politics and distract from the truth. And pressing another country to engage in corruption is antithetical to who we are as a nation. You also mentioned that this request, well, you felt this request was wrong. And you've also said that corruption in Ukraine is endemic to Ukraine, just as it is in other places around the world. Can you speak to what is the danger of a president of the United States, whether it's Donald Trump or any future president, asking another nation where there's rampant corruption to investigate a political rival or just any other American citizen? What would be the danger to that American?
Congressman, the Ukrainian judiciary is imperfect at the moment, and the reliance on U.S. support could conceivably cause them to tip the scales of justice in favor of finding the U.S. citizen guilty if they thought they needed to do that international.
So they could trump up charges if they wanted to in a corrupt system like that.
They could, and Ukraine is making progress. Certainly, more broadly in Russia, that is likely to happen, where the state will be involved in judicial outcomes and drive them.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Williams, you testified that what you noted as being unusual about the call that took place on July 25th was that the president raised what appeared to be a domestic political issue, correct?
Correct.
But raising an issue, even one that you thought was unusual, is different than making a demand. Would you agree?
Yes.
And as I read your deposition, it didn't sound like from your testimony that you heard what took place on that call as a demand for investigations. Is that fair?
I don't believe I'm in a position to characterize it further than the president did in terms of asking for a favor.
You didn't hear a demand?
Again, I would just refer back to the transcript itself.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you've testified and explained to us why in your mind it was a demand. And you've given us reasons, the disparity of power between the two presidents. And because you did feel that way, you also felt that you had a duty to report what you thought was improper. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So two different people, two impartial observers, one felt the need to report the call because there was a demand that was improper, and one that didn't report it to anyone. You didn't report it to anyone, right, Ms. Williams?
I ensured that the information was available to my superiors.
So while all this might seem as clear as mud, I think your honest and candid assessments of what you heard on the call tells us what we need to know. We have two independent folks, nonpartisans, and I'm not hearing a consensus between the two of you about what exactly you both heard on the call that you heard at the exact same time. And if you can't reach an agreement with regard to what happened on the call, how can any of us? An impeachment inquiry is supposed to be clear. It's supposed to be obvious. It's supposed to be overwhelming and compelling. And if two people on the call disagree honestly about whether or not there was a demand and whether or not anything should be reported on a call, that is not a clear and compelling basis to undo 63 million votes and remove a president from office. I yield my remaining time to Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Colonel Vindman, why didn't you go after the call? Why didn't you go to Mr. Morrison?
I went immediately per the instructions from the July 10th incident. I went immediately to Mr. Eisenberg. After that, once I made that, expressed my concerns, it was an extremely busy week. We had a PCC just finish. We had the call, and then we had a deputies meeting, which consumed all of my time. I was working extremely long days. I attempted to try to communicate. I managed to speak to two folks in the interagency. I attempted to try to talk to Mr. Morrison. That didn't happen before I received instructions from John Eisenberg to not talk to anybody else any further.
So the lawyer, you not only didn't go to your boss, you said you tried, but you didn't go to your boss. You went straight to the lawyer, and the lawyer told you not to go to your boss?
No, he didn't tell me until what ended up unfolding is I had the conversation with the attorney. I did my coordination, my core function, which is coordination. I spoke to the appropriate people within the interagency, and then circling back around, Mr. Eisenberg came back to me and told me not to talk to anybody
I'm going to
else.
read from the transcript here. Why didn't you go to your direct report, Mr. Morrison? Your response was, this page 102, because Mr. Eisenberg had told me to take my concerns to him. Then I asked you, did Mr. Eisenberg tell you not to report, to go around Mr. Morrison? And you said, actually, he did say that. I shouldn't talk to any other people. Is that right?
Yes, but there's a period of time in there between when I spoke to him and when he circled back around. It wasn't that long a period of time, but it was enough time for me to...
Enough time to go to talk to someone that you won't tell us who it is, right?
I've been instructed not to, Representative Jordan.
Well, here's what I'm getting. The lawyer told you don't talk to any other people, and you interpret that as not talking to your boss, but you talk to your brother, you talk to the lawyers, you talk to Secretary Kent, and you talk to the one guy Adam Schiff won't let you tell us who he is. Is that right?
Representative Jordan, I did my job.
I'm not saying you didn't. All I'm saying is the instructions from the lawyer was you shouldn't talk to anybody, and you interpret that as don't talk to my boss, but I'm going to go talk to someone that we can't even ask you who that individual is.
That is incorrect.
Well, I just read what you said.
That is
I shouldn't
incorrect.
talk to any other
The
people.
gentleman has expired.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chairman, but
Yes,
that sequence is not the way it played out.
I'm reading from your transcript, Colonel Vindman.
Mr. Jordan, please let Colonel Vindman answer.
There's the sequence played out where immediately afterwards I expressed my concerns. I did my coordination function. Mr. Eisenberg circled back around, told me not to talk to anybody else. In that period of time, I did not manage
So
to talk
that's
to you.
when it happened.
Mr.
That's
Heck,
when you
are
talk to someone.
recognized. Mr. Heck?
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Vindman, let's go back to that pair of meetings on July 10th in Ambassador Bolton's office and down in the boardroom where you witnessed Ambassador Sondland inform the Ukrainian officials that as a prerequisite to a White House meeting between the two presidents, quote, the Ukrainians would have to deliver an investigation into the Bidens, end quote. You said that Ambassador Sondland was, quote, calling for an investigation that didn't exist into the Bidens and Burisma. Is that correct?
That is correct.
It's that same afternoon you went to Mr. Eisenberg, the counsel, correct?
That meeting occurred in the afternoon, and within, a couple hours, I'm sure it was within a couple hours I spoke to Mr. Eisenberg.
How did he react?
He was cool, calm, and collected. He took notes, and he said he would look into it.
And did he not also tell you to feel free to come back if you
did.
had additional concerns?
He did, Congressman.
Ambassador Sondland had told you that his request to the Ukrainians had been coordinated with the Chief of Staff, acting Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney. Did you report that to Mr. Eisenberg?
I did.
And what was his reaction?
He took notes, and he said he'll follow up or look into it. I don't recall exactly what he said.
Colonel, you have also testified that on the July 25th call now between the two presidents, quote, there was no doubt, end quote, that President Trump asked for investigations into the 2016 election and Vice President Biden's son in return for a White House meeting. Within an hour of that call, you reported that to Mr. Eisenberg, did you not?
I did.
Went back to him just as he had suggested would be appropriate?
He's an assistant to the president. It was less a suggestion, more of an instruction.
Did you tell the lawyers that President Trump asked President Zelensky to speak to Mr. Giuliani?
Yes.
And the lawyers, it was at this point, told you not to talk to anyone else?
That is not correct with regards to timing. They didn't follow back. They didn't circle back around. What ended up happening is, in my coordination role, I spoke to state. I spoke to a member of the intelligence community, and the general counsel from one of the intelligence bodies notified Mr. Eisenberg that there was information on the call, on the July 25th call. At that point, Mr. Eisenberg told me I shouldn't talk to anybody else about it.
Colonel, I want to go back to 2014 in Iraq when you were blown up. I presume that given the point in your military career and what else was going on in the world, that upon recovery there was the very real prospect or possibility that you might once again find yourself in harm's way. Is that correct?
Yes, Congressman, it happened in 2004, but yes.
Excuse me, thank you. Did you consider leaving the military service at that point?
No, frankly, Congressman, I suffered light wounds. I was fortunate compared to my counterparts in the same vehicle, and I returned to duty I think it may have been that same day.
But you could have been subjected to additional harm. You chose to continue service in uniform.
I continued to serve in combat for the remaining 10 or 11 months of the tour.
You know, Colonel, I have to say, I find it a rich but incredibly painful irony that within a week of the president, contrary to all advice of the senior military officials, he pardons those who were convicted of war crimes, which was widely decried in the military community. Within the week of him doing that, he is engaged in an effort, and allies on his behalf, including some here today, to demean your record of service and the sacrifice and the contribution you have made. Indeed, sir, less than 20 minutes ago, the White House officially quoted out of context, the comments referred to earlier by Mr. Morrison in your judgment. I can only conclude, sir, that what we thought was just the president as the subject of our deliberations in this inquiry isn't sufficient to capture what's happening here. Indeed, what's subject to this inquiry and what is at peril is our Constitution and the very values upon which it is based. I want to say thank you for your service, but you know, thank you doesn't cut it. Please know, however, that it comes from the bottom of my heart, and I know on the bottoms of the heart of countless other Americans. Thank you for your service, sir. I yield back.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sunday, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives called the President of the United States an imposter. Speaker of the House called the President an imposter. The guy 63 million people voted for, the guy who won an electoral college landslide, the Speaker calls an imposter. That's what's happened to our country, to this Congress. The Speaker's statement says it all. The Democrats have never accepted the will of the American people. Democrats don't trust the American people. The American people who wanted to send someone to this town who was willing to shake it up a bit, they don't trust that. And they have tried to do everything they can to undo what the American people decided on November 8th, 2016. They've been out to get the president since the day he was elected. The whistleblower's lawyer, the whistleblower's legal team said this, January 30th, 2017, president been in office about a week. Coup has started. First of many steps. Next sentence, impeachment will follow ultimately. I guess we're in the final step. Started 3.5 years ago. Congressman Tlaib started this Congress. First day of Congress said, impeach the president. Representative Green said, if we don't impeach him, the president's going to win re-election. We got to do it. Most importantly, 5 Democrat members of this committee voted to move forward with impeachment before the phone call ever happened. The truth is, the attacks actually started before the inauguration, even before the election. The ranking member talked about this in his opening statement. July 2016, FBI opens an investigation, so-called Trump-Russia coordination, collusion, which was never there. Opened an investigation, spied on 2 American citizens associated with the presidential campaign. My guess is that's probably never happened in American history, but they did it. And for 10 months, Jim Comey's FBI investigated the president. Guess what? After 10 months, they had nothing. And you know why we know that? Because when we deposed Mr. Comey last Congress, he told us they didn't have a thing. No matter. Special Counsel Mueller gets appointed, and they do a 2-year, $40 million, 19-lawyer, unbelievable investigation. And guess what? They come back, and they got nothing. But the Democrats don't care. So now we get this. Bunch of depositions in the bunker in the basement of the Capitol. Witnesses who aren't allowed to answer questions about who they talked to about the phone call. We get this. All based on some anonymous whistleblower, no firsthand knowledge, bias against the president. These facts have never changed. We learned these right away. Who worked with Vice President Biden, who wrote a memo the day after somebody talked to him about the call, but waited 18 days to file a complaint. 18 days to file a complaint. What did he do in those 18 days? We all know. Ran off and talked with Chairman Schiff's staff. And then hired the legal team that I just talked about. One of the steps in the whole impeachment coup, as his legal team has said. This is scary what these guys are putting our country through. It is sad, it is scary, it is wrong. And the good news is the American people see through it all, They know the facts are on the president's side. As Representative Stefanik said, 4 facts will never change. We got the transcript, which they never thought the president would release. Shows no coordination, no conditionality, no linkage. We got the 2 guys on the call, President Trump, President Zelensky, who have said nothing wrong, no pressure, no pushing here. We got the fact the Ukrainians didn't even know aid was held up at the time of the call. And most importantly, we've yet to have one witness tell us that any evidence from anyone that President Zelensky did anything on investigations to get the aid released. Those facts will never change. The facts are on the president's side. The process is certainly not. It has been the most unfair process we have ever seen, and the American people understand it. Those 63 million Americans, they understand it, and frankly, I think a lot of others do as well. They see what this for what it is, and they know this is wrong, especially wrong, just 11 months before the next election. I yield back.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you. What this hearing is about, I think, was best stated by Colonel Vindman's opening statement. The question before us is this: is it improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a United States citizen and political opponent? Very well stated. I just listened to Mr. Jordan, as you did as well, and I heard his criticisms of the process. Nothing really happened. A lot of people are out to get the president. I didn't hear an answer to the question as to whether it's proper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government to investigate a U.S. citizen and political opponent. And to date, I haven't heard any one of my Republican colleagues address that question. Colonel Vindman and Ms. Williams, thank you. I want to ask some questions that go through the background. What's come out during this process is that we had 2 Ukraine policies. One was bipartisan and longstanding, and that was to assist Ukraine, which had freed itself from the domination of Russia, to fight corruption and to resist Russian aggression. Is that a fair statement, Colonel Vindman?
I think that's a fair characterization, Congressman.
And to give folks a reminder of the extent of corruption, by the way, a legacy of Putin's Russia, is it your understanding that when their prior president, Mr. Yanukovych, fled to Russia into the arms of Mr. Putin, he took with him $30 to $40 billion of that impoverished country?
Those, there are different estimates, but it's on that scale, yes.
Vast scale for a poor country. And is it your understanding that powerless but motivated Ukrainians rose up in protest to this incredible graft and theft and abuse by their president?
That is correct.
And that was in the Maidan, it was called the Maidan Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, correct?
Correct.
And young people went into that square in downtown Kyiv and demonstrated for months, correct?
Correct. And 100 died.
106 young people died and older people died, correct? That was between February 18, 2014 and February 22. Is that correct?
Correct.
106 died, including people who were shot by snipers, kids. And Yanukovych had put snipers on the rooftops of buildings to shoot into that square and kill, murder, slaughter those young people. Is that your understanding?
That is correct.
In our bipartisan support, and by the way, I want to say to my Republican colleagues, a lot of leadership to have this bipartisan support came from your side. Thank you. But our whole commitment was to get rid of corruption and to stop that Russian aggression. Is that correct?
That amounts to some of the key pillars.
That's right. And the Giuliani, Sondland, and it appears Trump policy was not about that. It was about investigations into a political opponent, correct? I'll take that question back. We know it. And you know, I'll say this to President Trump. You want to investigate Joe Biden, you want to investigate Hunter Biden, go at it. Do it. Do it hard. Do it dirty. Do it the way you do it. Just don't do it by asking a foreign leader to help you in your campaign. That's your job. It's not his. My goal in these hearings is two things. One is to get an answer to Colonel Vindman's question. And the second, coming out of this, is for us as a Congress to return to the Ukraine policy that Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy both support. It's not investigations. It's the restoration of democracy in Ukraine and the resistance of Russian aggression. I yield back.
Mr. Maloney.
Thank you both for being here. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, this may be one of your first congressional hearings like this, so you may not understand. I can't blame you for feeling that way, sir. Particularly when I've been sitting here listening to my Republican colleagues. You know, one of the advantages of being down here at the kids' table is that you get to hear the folks above you ask their questions. And I've been listening closely to my Republican colleagues, and I've heard them say just about everything except to contradict any of the substantive testimony you've both given. You may have noticed there's been a lot of complaints, and there's been a lot of insinuations, and there's been a lot of suggestions maybe that your service is somehow not to be trusted. You know, you were treated to questions about your loyalty because of some half-baked job offer, I guess, the Ukrainians made you, which you, of course, dutifully reported. I guess Mr. Castor is implying maybe you've got some dual loyalty, which is, of course, an old smear we've heard many times in our history. They tried to demean you as though maybe you've overstated your importance of your job. But, of course, you were the guy on the National Security Council responsible for directing Ukrainian policy. We've heard them air out some allegations with no basis in proof, but they just want to get them out there and hope maybe some of those strands of spaghetti, I guess, will stick on the wall if they keep throwing them. We've even had a member of this committee question, this is my favorite, question why you would wear your dress uniform today. Even though that dress uniform includes a breastplate that has a combat infantry badge on it and a Purple Heart medal ribbon. Seems like if anybody gets to wear their uniform, it's somebody who's got a breastplate with those commendations on it. So let's do it again. Let's do the substance. Can we do that? Because we've had a lot of dust kicked up. Ms. Williams, you heard the call with your own ears, right?
Yes, sir.
Not secondhand, not hearsay. You heard the president speak. You heard his voice on the call.
Correct.
And your conclusion was what he said about investigating the Bidens was, your words, unusual and inappropriate, I believe. Am I right?
That was my testimony.
And Mr. Vindman, you were treated to a July 10th meeting in the White House where you heard Ambassador Sondland raise investigations, conditioning a White House meeting on that, investigations that you thought were unduly political. I believe that's how you described them. And you went to NSC Council and you reported it, right?
Correct.
And then later, you too were on the White House call. Am I right? You heard it with your own ears.
Correct.
Not secondhand, not from somebody else, not hearsay, right?
Correct.
You heard the president's voice on the call.
I did.
And you heard him raise that subject again that Ambassador Sondland had raised before about investigating the Bidens, right?
I did.
And I want to ask you, when you heard him say that, what was the first thought that went through your mind?
Frankly, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was probably an element of shock that maybe in certain regards my worst fear of how our Ukraine policy could play out was playing out, and how this was likely to have significant implications for U.S. national security.
And you went immediately and you reported it, didn't you?
I did.
Why?
Because that was my duty.
You still have your opening statement handy?
I do.
Could you read the last paragraph for me again? Not the one, the very last one, the second to last one. Would you read that one again for me? Because I think the American public deserves to hear it again.
The dad, start.
That's the one.
I think my dad would appreciate this one too. Dad, my sitting here today in the U.S. Capitol talking to our elected officials is proof that you made the right decision 40 years ago to leave the Soviet Union and come here to the United States of America in search of a better life for our family. Do not worry, I'll be fine for telling the truth.
You realize when you came forward out of sense of duty that you were putting yourself in direct opposition to the most powerful person in the world. Do you realize that, sir?
I knew I was assuming a lot of risk.
And I'm struck by that word, don't worry, that phrase, do not worry, you addressed to your dad. Was your dad a warrior?
He did serve. It was a different military, though.
And he would have worried if you were putting yourself up against the President of the United States, is that right?
He deeply worried about it because in his context, there was the ultimate risk.
And why do you have confidence that you can do that and tell your dad not to worry?
Congressman, because this is America. This is the country I've served and defended, that all of my brothers have served, and here, right matters.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Ms. Demings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Ms. Williams, let me thank you for your service to our nation. It truly matters. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I had the honor of speaking to a group of veterans this past weekend. And what I said to them was that no words are really adequate or sufficient to fully express our gratitude for their service to our nation. So, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, today I say to you, there are no words that are sufficient to fully express our gratitude to you for what you have done for our nation and, amazingly, what you are still willing to do for our nation. It is vitally important that the American people understand how President Trump's unethical demand that Ukraine deliver politically motivated investigations in exchange for military assistance created a security risk for the United States of America national security. The president was not just playing a political game by upholding military aid and meetings with Ukraine. Threatening the hundreds of millions of dollars of military assistance that Congress had appropriated has real-life consequences for Ukraine and for the USA. In your deposition, Colonel Vindman, you testified, and I quote, "A strong and independent Ukraine is critical to our security interests." Could you please explain why a strong and independent Ukraine is so critical and why it is so vital to U.S. interests?
We sometimes refer to Ukraine as a frontline state. It's on the front line of Europe. They have actually described to me, the Ukrainians, that they consider themselves as a barrier between Russian aggression and Europe. And what I've heard them describe is the need for U.S. support in order to serve this role, in order to protect European and Western security.
Lieutenant Colonel, this is not just a theoretical conflict between Ukraine and Russia. You've already said this morning that Russia is actively fighting to expand into Ukraine, that Ukraine is in a hot war with Russia right now. Is that correct?
It's stable, but it's still a hot war.
And isn't it true, Lieutenant Colonel, that even if the security assistance was eventually delivered to Ukraine, the fact that it was delayed, just that fact, could signal to Russia that the bond between Ukraine and the U.S. was weakening?
That was the concern of myself and my colleagues.
And was the risk of even the appearance that the U.S.-Ukraine bond is shaky is that it could embolden Russia to act with more aggression? Would you say that's correct?
I believe that was my testimony.
Just last month during an interview, President Putin joked about interfering in our political elections. I can only guess that's what we have become to Russia and its president. I think he felt emboldened by the president's reckless actions, both attempts to hold critical military aid from Ukraine and President Trump's effort to blame Ukraine, not Russia, for election interference. Ms. Williams and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I can only say that every American, regardless of our politics, should be critically concerned about that. And let me just say this. Yes, we do trust the American people. But you know what? The American people trust us, too, as members of Congress, to support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we intend to do just that. Thank you again for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Good afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Ms. Williams. Thank you for your service. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I'm concerned that your loyalty has been questioned not just because you're bringing forward evidence of wrongdoing against the President of the United States, but because you're an immigrant. Recently, Fox News host Brian Kilmeade said he, meaning you, were born in the Soviet Union, emigrated with his family young. He tends to feel simpatico with the Ukraine. I find this statement reprehensible because it appears that your immigrant heritage is being used against you. Lieutenant Colonel, I came to this country when I was 3 months old. Your family fled the Soviet Union and moved to America when you were just 3.5 years old, right?
Correct.
And I understand that your father worked multiple jobs while also learning English, right?
Correct.
Your father stressed the importance of embracing what it means to be an American, correct?
That is correct.
All your childhood memories relate to being an American, correct?
That is correct.
You and your family faced difficult times during your childhood, correct?
Yes.
I can relate. That's my story, too. But your father went on to become an engineer, right?
He reestablished himself in his former profession in the United States.
I can relate. I got a BS in engineering. Of course, some people claim I practice the BS part now. Your father never gave up working hard to build his very own American dream, did he?
He did not.
Well, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, your father achieved the American dream, and so did you and your family. From one immigrant American to another immigrant American, I want to say to you that you and your family represent the very best of America. I assume that you are as proud to be an American as I am, correct?
Yes, sir.
Sir, I want to turn your attention to Yuri Lutsenko. You called him a disruptive actor in your opening statement, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Lutsenko, the former prosecutor general in Ukraine, has made various claims about various Americans, right?
Correct.
You are unaware of any factual basis for his accusations against Ambassador Yovanovitch, right?
Correct.
He also was a source for an article by John Solomon in The Hill, right?
That is correct.
And you said that key elements of that article, as well as his accusations, are false, right?
Correct.
Lutsenko is not a credible source, correct?
Correct.
Sir, the other side claims that there was absolutely no pressure on this July 25th phone call. I think that's what we heard earlier, right?
I believe so.
And you have termed what President Trump asked in terms of investigations on that phone call as a demand, correct?
Correct.
And you've pointed out the large power disparity between President Trump on the one hand and President Zelensky on the other, correct?
Yes.
There was pressure on that phone call, right?
The Ukrainians needed the meeting. The Ukrainians subsequently when they found out about it, needed the security assistance.
So pressure was brought to bear on them, correct?
I believe so.
Sir, Colonel Vindman, last week we heard a decorated military veteran, namely Ambassador Bill Taylor, come before us. You interacted regularly with Ambassador Taylor, and you know him to be a man of integrity, and he's a patriotic American, isn't that right?
Superb individual.
I asked Ambassador Taylor a series of questions based on his experience as an infantry commander. I asked him, quote, is an officer allowed to hold up action placing his troops at risk until someone provides them a personal benefit? Ambassador Taylor responded, no, sir. Colonel Vindman, do you agree with Ambassador Taylor?
I do.
I then asked Ambassador Taylor, quote, is that because they would be betraying their responsibility to the nation? Ambassador Taylor responded, yes, sir. Colonel Vindman, do you agree with Ambassador Taylor?
I do.
I then asked Ambassador Taylor, quote, could that type of conduct trigger a court-martial? Ambassador Taylor said, yes, sir. Do you agree with Ambassador Taylor, Colonel Vindman?
I do.
Thank you for your service.
Concludes the member questioning. Representative Nunes, you're recognized for any concluding remarks.
Well, Act 1 of today's circus is over. For those of you who have been watching it at home, the Democrats are no closer to impeachment than where they were 3 years ago. In the process, the Department of Justice, FBI, State Department, elements within the IC, the ICIG, have all suffered long-term damage. The Democrats can continue to poison the American people with this nonsense. We sit here all morning without any evidence for impeachment, which would be a very serious crime, high crime and misdemeanors, as it says in the Constitution. No such thing. Policy disagreements and the Democrats' failure to acknowledge their involvement in the 2016 election, I would say it's astonishing, but that would be putting too little emphasis on their actions. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. I want to thank our witnesses today, Ms. Williams, Colonel Vindman, both of you for your service to the country, for your testimony here today. And I just want to address briefly some of the evidence you presented, as well as others thus far in the impeachment inquiry. First of all, I want to join my colleagues in thanking you, Colonel Vindman, for your military service. And I should tell you that notwithstanding all of the questions you got on why didn't you go talk to your supervisor, why didn't you go talk to Mr. Morrison, why did you go to the national security lawyer, as if there's something wrong with going to the national security lawyer. Are you aware that we asked Mr. Morrison whether he went to the national security lawyer right after the call, and that he did?
I am.
And are you aware also that we asked him, well, if you had this problem with Colonel Vindman not going to you instead of the lawyer, naturally you must have gone to your supervisor, and you know what his answer was? He didn't go to his supervisor either. He went directly to the National Security Council lawyer. So I hope my colleagues will give him the same hard time for not following his chain of command that he complained about with you, apparently. The president may attack you, and has. Others on right-wing TV might attack you, and they have. But I thought you should know, and maybe you know already, that this is what the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had to say about you, Colonel Vindman. He is a professional, competent, patriotic, and loyal officer. He has made an extraordinary contribution to the security of our nation in both peacetime and combat. I'm sure your dad is proud to hear that. My colleagues have tried to make the argument here today, and we've heard it before, that the president was just interested in fighting corruption. That's our goal, fighting corruption in Ukraine, this terribly corrupt country. The problem, of course, with that is there's no evidence of the president trying to fight corruption. The evidence all points in the other direction. The evidence points in the direction of the president inviting Ukraine to engage in the corrupt act of investigating a U.S. political opponent. Ambassador Yovanovitch was known as a strong fighter of corruption, so what does the president do? He recalls her from her post. Ambassador Yovanovitch, in fact, was at a meeting celebrating other anti-corruption fighters, including a woman who had acid thrown in her face on the day she was told to get on the next plane back to Washington. You prepared talking points for the president's first conversation with Zelensky. He's supposed to talk about rooting out corruption. If this president had such a deep interest in rooting out corruption in Ukraine, surely he would have brought it up on the call, but of course we now know that he did not. We then see Rudy Giuliani not fighting corruption, but asking for an investigation of the Bidens. And my colleagues say, well, maybe he was acting on his own. Even though he says he's acting as the president's lawyer, maybe he was really acting on his own. But the two investigations that Rudy Giuliani wanted come up in the meeting you participate in on July 10th at the White House, when Ambassador Sondland brings up the Bidens and Burisma in 2016, tells the Ukrainians who want that meeting at the White House, you got to do these investigations. Now, they would say Ambassador Sondland was acting on his own, but that doesn't quite work either, because we have the call record from July 25th, which the president was forced to release, in which the president doesn't bring up corruption. He doesn't say how those anti-corruption courts going or great work in the RADA. Of course not. What does the president say? I want you to investigate the Bidens and this debunk conspiracy theory pushed by Vladimir Putin. That also helps me in my reelection. So much for fighting corruption. The message to Ukraine, the real message to Ukraine, our U.S. policy message is, don't engage in political investigations. The message from the president, however, was the exact opposite. Do engage in political investigations, and do it for my reelection. And it's also made clear, if they want the White House meeting, and ultimately if they want $400 million in U.S. aid, this is what they have to do. The only lament I hear from my colleagues is, it wasn't successful. They got caught. They didn't get the political investigations, and they still had to release the money. Now, they still haven't gotten the White House meeting, but they had to release the money because a whistleblower blew the whistle. Whistleblower the president wants to punish. And because Congress announced it was doing investigations, and very soon thereafter, the president was forced to lift the hold on the aid. They argue, well, this makes it okay that it was a failed effort to bribe Ukraine, a failed effort to extort Ukraine. That doesn't make it better. It's no less odious because it was discovered and it was stopped. And we have courageous people like yourself who come forward, who report things, who do what they should do, who have a sense, as you put it, Colonel, of duty. Of duty. Not to the person of the president, but to the presidency and to the country. And we thank you for that. At the end of the day, I think this all comes back to something we heard from another career Foreign Service officer just last Friday in a conversation he overheard with the president in a restaurant in Ukraine, in which the president, not Rudy Giuliani, not anyone else, the president of the United States wanted to know, are they going to do the investigations? This is the day after that July 25th call. Are they going to do the investigations? And he's assured by Ambassador Sondland they're going to do it. And what does Sondland relate to this Foreign Service officer after he hangs up that call? The president doesn't give an expletive about Ukraine. He only cares about the big things that help his personal interests. That's all you need to know. And it isn't just about Ukraine, of course. Ukraine is fighting our fight against the Russians, against their expansionism. That's our fight too. That's our fight too. At least we thought so on a bipartisan basis. That's our fight too. That's why we support Ukraine with the military aid that we have. Well, the president may not care about it, but we do. We care about our defense. We care about the defense of our allies. And we darn well care about our Constitution. We are adjourned.
And today's hearing, ending as it began, diametrically opposed positions from the Republicans and Democrats on the committee of the evidence presented so far in these 3 days, 2.5 days so far, of hearings in this impeachment proceeding, and very different views of what boils down to that July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine. You heard the witness there, Colonel Vindman, say that as he heard this playing out, as he heard the president ask for a favor, these political investigations, he thought his worst fears were playing out. You saw Republicans again and again on the committee say that others could hear that same phone call and the efforts around it and not see anything illegal, much less impeachable. The questioning more pointed in the second half of this hearing, but definitely more political as well. And I want to bring in senior congressional correspondent Mary Bruce to start us off. More direct questioning of the credibility of Alexander Vindman, Colonel Vindman, in the second half of the hearing.
Yeah, George, there's no question, especially Republicans were sharpening their line of questioning here, and it seems they were trying to check a lot of boxes. Republicans were trying to make the argument to the American people, essentially, that there's nothing to see here, and it seems they're also trying to show the president that they are launching a fierce defense. They were questioning Colonel Vindman's credibility and his loyalty, arguing that these witnesses who heard that July 25th phone call were simply sharing their opinion of what they heard. While Democrats, on the flip side, it is clear that they believe these witnesses boost their argument that the president abused his power. The president has said the call was perfect. Well, that's not what these witnesses heard. They said that what they heard was alarming and inappropriate. And I think if we take a step back here, George, the president has said that what he did on that call was not wrong, that there was nothing wrong that he did. And yet we are hearing from a growing number of officials who say the opposite, that they believe that what they saw, what they witnessed, what they overheard was concerning. I have asked Republicans here if all of these other witnesses are simply wrong, and their argument is that it's not a matter of whether the president did something that's inappropriate. This inquiry is about whether what the president did was impeachable. It is clear they do not think it is. Democrats, though, say there is growing evidence that the president has committed bribery, and that is an impeachable offense.
They're moving in that direction, though, too, and perhaps because when you look at public opinion, 2 polls have come out now in the last few days showing 70% of the public do believe that what the president's phone call, what he did on the phone call was wrong, regardless of what they were thinking of whether or not it's illegal or impeachable. Martha Raddatz, we saw not only members of the committee questioning in somewhat indirect terms the loyalty of Colonel Vindman. You also saw the president himself during this hearing raising questions about whether Colonel Vindman should have been wearing this uniform at the hearing.
In a mocking tone, the president said, "I understand now he wears his uniform when he goes in. I understand someone had the misfortune of calling him Mr., and he corrected them. I never saw the man." The president, by the way, knows that in the NSC, Vindman would wear a suit, I assume. And that's if you're put someplace else, even though you're in uniform, you do what the NSC would do, what that culture does. But as far as wearing a uniform today, the Army says a soldier performing duties in an official capacity will normally be in uniform. And what Vindman himself said is, "I'm in my uniform wearing my military rank. I just thought it was appropriate to stick with that." He also, of course, was asked, as the president was mocking him, he corrected Devin Nunes, saying it is Lieutenant Colonel, not Mr. And he said he did that because the attacks I have had in the press and Twitter have kind of eliminated the fact that, or either marginalized me as a military officer. So he was clearly trying to make a point, but he was also required to wear that uniform.
That when he's in his official duties. John Carl at the White House, the president, much more active generally during the second half of this hearing. The White House pushing back as well all morning long.
All morning long. In fact, the president, in a space of just a few minutes, retweeted more than a dozen times Republicans talking about this hearing, Republican talking points. The president had a cabinet meeting. That's when he made the comments about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's uniform. He also, in that cabinet meeting, said that Republicans, quote, "are absolutely killing it. They are doing so because it's a scam. It's a big scam." But one thing that was particularly notable to me, George, was that the official White House Twitter account actually attacked Vindman. Take a look at this. This is, again, the official White House Twitter account, quoting Timothy Morrison, who is going to be testifying this afternoon, questioning Vindman's judgment. That was something that he had done in closed testimony. But this is an extraordinary moment. Look at that tweet. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is assigned he goes to work at the White House every day. He works on the National Security Council. And here it is, the White House tweeting an attack questioning his judgment. Keep in mind, He still works there. Presumably tomorrow he will go back to work at the National Security Council.
Again, something we have never seen before right there. Mary talked about the Democrats bringing up the issue of bribery. Of course, that's written in the Constitution as a possible impeachable offense. And both parties really honed in on that during this hearing. I want to start out by playing Republican Representative John Ratcliffe.
The number of times witnesses have used the word bribery or bribe to describe President Trump's conduct in the last 6 weeks of this inquiry is zero. In fact, in these 3,500 pages of sworn deposition testimony and just these 10 transcripts released thus far, the word bribery appears in these 3,500 pages exactly one time. And ironically, it appears not in a description of President Trump's alleged conduct. It appears in a description of Vice President Biden's alleged conduct.
Wanted to just make one point clear for folks that are watching the hearing today. Bribery does involve a quid pro quo. Bribery involves the conditioning of an official act for something of value. An official act may be a White House meeting. An official act may be $400 million in military aid. And something of value to a president might include investigations of their political rival.
Dan Abrams, it appears so clear now that this is going to be a key question that both parties are going to be contending with, as not only here in the Intelligence Committee, but presumably in the Judiciary Committee when they drop articles of impeachment as well.
Absolutely. And you have to remember, we're not talking about a legal argument from these witnesses. These are witnesses. They're not lawyers. I mean, the argument that, oh, bribery hasn't been mentioned by the witnesses are being asked to describe what did you see, not being asked to do an analysis of what does it mean. Does this mean you haven't heard any of the witnesses say, I think he should be impeached or not impeached? It's not their role. It's not their job. Same way it's not their role and it's not their job to say, this is bribery or this isn't bribery. It's their role and their job to say, this is what I saw. I was concerned about it. I wasn't concerned about it. This is what troubled me. This isn't what troubled me. That's very different. And let me just follow up on one thing that Martha had talked about the uniform. Just think about where we are. I mean, the fact that we're in a proceeding where anyone's even questioning a war hero wearing his uniform, whether he wears it, whether he usually wears it or not usually wears it, typically we would say, why would you even be asking that sort of question of a witness like that? And the fact that we're at a point where everything is so partisan that even whether he's wearing his uniform and when is he supposed to wear his uniform in any other context would never be asked.
It's extraordinary. It is true. And Melissa Murray, one of the reasons you see the Democrats honing in on the issue of bribery is that it is written inside the Constitution. I guess it's easier for most people to understand. And this whole term, high crimes and misdemeanors, has always been difficult to define and for people to understand.
Well, again, it was sort of broadly textured and purposely so. Alexander Hamilton, when speaking about the impeachment clause, talked about the offenses and misdeeds of public men. So again, they were thinking about general abuses of power. So it's actually not that far off the mark from what we're seeing. But of course, bribery would resonate more clearly with a modern audience.
And Chris Christie, what do you think is the strongest argument the Republicans were making in defense today, and the strongest argument you saw from the Democrats?
Well, listen, the strongest argument from the Republicans is that there's just not enough there, that they're trying to read the president's mind in terms of what his intent was. And I think you saw Jennifer Williams say something very different than Colonel Vindman did.
She said unusual, not as troubling.
Right,
yeah.
and then they asked her directly about whether she thought that was a demand. And she said, no, I'll leave it to what my previous testimony was. And listen, on the Democrat side, it's kind of like an old trial lawyer's argument. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And so that's the conflict you're having here. And in the end, when you have that kind of factual conflict in something that's as high a bar as an impeachment, they'll impeach him because they've got 218 votes. And Nancy Pelosi would have never authorized this if she didn't know she had 218 votes. So he will be impeached, but he won't be removed. And so the American public's going to look at this, in my view, afterwards and say, what did we go through all this for?
And Terry Moran, that does seem to be one of the things that several of the Republican members were banking on at the end. Whether or not you think it was wrong, 11 months before an election, should we be doing this?
And that's a question that American voters will have and resolve for themselves. But I think for a lot of Democrats and a lot of others, the specter of a president abusing power in this way, in their view, through bribery. Bribery not as defined in the modern statutory criminal code, but as the founders understood it, the abuse of office for private gain, a very broad conception of bribery. For a president to do that and not be held accountable in some way. I think they want to lay down a marker for future presidents, and I think deep down Republicans might want that as well. It seems at the end of the day, there may be a majority for censure. Nobody knows really at this point. Although really, the defenses the Republicans offered here were all over the map. What were they saying about Vindman? That he didn't follow the chain of command, that he's loyal to Ukraine, that he's trying to usurp the power of the president? You know, when I covered jury trials, that many options in a defense lawyer meant a bad defense. The real defense, be loyal to President Trump. And I think at the end of the day, that's going to be a challenge for them as well.
One place, Pierre, thank you, Terry. Pierre Thomas, the president, did get some loyalty. Remember, this all began with the whistleblower's complaint, which led to a criminal referral to the Justice Department, led by Attorney General Barr.
George, that's exactly right. The tension between the president, the White House, and some of the career staff is what's striking me about all of this. As you recall, the whistleblower filed a complaint. The intelligence community inspector general looked at that complaint, deemed it of enough concern to refer it to the Justice Department for a criminal investigation. That's a fact. That's what happened. The Justice Department looked at it in a very narrow sense in terms of the call itself, and determined that the call did not amount to a campaign finance violation. But, George, they did look at these other issues in terms of bribery and some of the other facts that have come out since, and that is the question going forward, George.
It is the question going forward. Also going to have another hearing this afternoon. Two more witnesses coming up, including David Muir. One witness's name that we heard a lot during this first hearing, the supervisor to Colonel Vindman, Tim Morrison.
Tim Morrison, it raises the stakes for him this afternoon. This is a Republican witness that we're talking about this afternoon. He has neglected to say so far whether or not he thinks anything illegal or improper happened, but his biggest fear, and we heard it this morning, was that this would be leaked, that the transcript of the phone call would somehow get out there over time. But this growing tension now between the Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Tim Morrison at the NSC will be something that's probed this afternoon. You also have Ambassador Kurt Volker, former special envoy to Ukraine. On the one hand, he said in his testimony already that he saw no evidence of a quid pro quo. On the other hand, though, he's part of the three amigos. Rick Perry, obviously Gordon Sondland, the EU ambassador, who are part of this back channel, and he'll be pressed about these text messages where he was helping to prep for this public statement from the new president of Ukraine in a back and forth saying, no, you've got to double down on these two key points, these two investigations.
Yeah, and Dan Abrams, it appears that Ambassador Volker and Ambassador Sondland, who's going to come up tomorrow, have similar issues. Sondland is somewhat more serious than those of Volker, where their recollections don't match up with what all the other witnesses, several of the other witnesses have come forward and said, and they're going to have to be making some revisions along the way.
Well, Sondland, very different than Volker, I think. I mean, I think that Volker has has apparently decided to change a little bit of his testimony and is going to be saying that he may not have been in the loop on certain things and that he may not have understood certain aspects.
Not what I said, for instance, the Burisma dealt with the Bidens.
It's right, exactly. With Sondland, it's different. Sondland, I had a conversation with him. He said this. And numerous witnesses talking about conversations with Sondland, which he's either going to have to say didn't happen, or I don't recall, or they did happen. And I think that's why he becomes the critical witness. The more Volker sort of adjusts his testimony, he becomes a little less significant. But I think it is important to something David mentioned. Remember that Volker and Morrison have been called by the Republicans. These were not people the Democrats asked to testify. The Republicans had a list of 9 witnesses. Democrats agreed to 3 of them. And all 3 of those are going to be testifying in the next 2 days, and this afternoon, it's both of them.
You know, David, it is significant. Volker resigned his position as the special envoy before agreeing to give the depositions several weeks ago.
And yet the Republicans are still asking him to come forward. Their suggestion here in inviting him as a witness is that he's going to provide for them this afternoon, although he's going to have to explain for those exchanges where he seemingly on the one hand says no quid pro quo, but then he's involved in the demand from Zelensky in exchange for the aid and for the White House meeting.
George, we're talking to get back to the law on this for a second. I think Dan will probably agree with this. Adam Schiff at the end talked about official act, right? And he said the White House meeting or the withholding of aid. Well, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously 4 years ago that the granting or denying of a meeting by an executive is not an official act under our statutes that govern bribery. So he's just wrong on that. That's the Bob McDonald case in Virginia.
The distinction between legal and
Well, no, I say, but Schiff was just trying to make a legal argument, right? So he's trying to buttress his impeachable argument by saying, if it's a violation of the law, we believe it's impeachable. Now, the aid's a different story, but the aid also, the Republicans will argue on the back end on the aid is, well, the aid eventually got there. So no harm, no foul, as you said earlier.
It's soliciting in and of itself, right? I mean, if you concede that the aid, withholding the aid is a potential crime, and again, just talking crime for a moment, that in and of itself may be enough.
Exactly. Listen, legally it would be, I think. But the Republicans are going to argue, they're going to switch it to impeachable and say, hey, no blood here because maybe he did that and maybe we think that's distasteful. But the aid ultimately went there. So I think Schiff's on a slippery slope if he tries to make this legal argument.
If they argue, yeah, it might be a crime, but it's not impeachable.
Well, they're not going to say that.
No, I understand they're not. But that's sort of the argument you just made.
I want to bring Melissa. I want to bring Melissa back in on this, though. It does though go back to, if you can look at what the founders were thinking about, debating about with impeachment. The whole idea of foreign interference in our political system was something that was very much on their mind.
Well, I think you overstate it, too, Governor Christie. I mean, what the founders were thinking was about this broad misuse of office, and everything that's been laid out here, as the Democrats want you to understand it, is about the misuse of office, misconduct, the misdeeds of public men. That doesn't need to be statutorily prescribed in order to be impeachable.
Listen, I totally agree with you. I was talking about the argument Adam Schiff was making. Adam Schiff was not making your argument. Adam Schiff was making a statutory argument. He was saying that denying of a White House meeting is an official act. Well, the Supreme Court has spoken on this right on topic 4 years ago with Bob McDonald from Virginia. There, he said to somebody, give this person a meeting. He was convicted by a jury on that and went to the United States Supreme Court and 8-0. They said that the granting or denying of a meeting by an executive is not an official act under the bribery statute. So I'm not arguing about what the founders thought. I was just listening to what Adam Schiff said, and what he said is wrong. The denying or the granting of a meeting is not an official act under the bribery statutes, and 8-0 the Supreme Court ruled that just 4 years ago.
Well, that's only if you're trying to link this to a statutory argument, which I don't think he was trying to do. I think he was trying to say that this broadly is about the misuse and abuse of power, not necessarily the misuse of power that constitutes an official act for the purposes of some federal.
He did refer to statutory language.
It was statutory language. It was official act. For those of us who prosecuted this for 7 years as a U.S. attorney, that's what you want. You want an official act that then they take some kind of money or other remuneration for, and that gets them. And the Supreme Court says no longer is a meeting enough.
And Mary Bruce, this is all coming as Democrats at least thinking about expanding what could possibly be an article of impeachment. We saw the top lawyer in the House go to court yesterday asking for grand jury evidence designed to show, build up the case that the president may have lied to Robert Mueller.
Yeah, George, Democrats we know are now exploring the possibility that the president wasn't truthful in those written answers that he submitted as part of the Russia investigation. We know that Democrats here, as they move towards impeachment, are considering not just focusing on the Ukraine issue, but also looking at whether or not the president obstructed the Russia investigation. And just one point on this argument about no harm, no foul. Well, Democrats are quick to point out that there are two big problems with that. One, as Republicans say that the aid was ultimately restarted, that freeze was lifted. Well, that only happened after Congress launched an investigation and after the whistleblower filed his or her complaint. And as for this argument that well, the investigations were never launched, well, we know from other witnesses that Ukrainian President Zelensky was prepared to go to the press and make a statement to that effect.
Okay, Mary, thanks very much. Before we go, the president was making some news on another front. I want to quickly go to Cecilia Vega at the White House. There have been all these questions swirling around the president's visit to Walter Reed on Saturday. The president addressed it directly during this hearing.
Yeah, George, it's the other fire that they are trying to put out here at the White House today, this speculation over the president's visit on Saturday. It was an unscheduled visit. He had not announced it before they went. The president is saying it's unusual because this was done in installments. I've got to tell you, they went this weekend. He says they're going to go again later in January, perhaps. President said that this was completely routine. George, the president's doctor, released a statement overnight saying as much. The White House is essentially saying that they had to get this done now because 2020 is going to be very busy.
Okay, and we're a busy day coming up. Another panel in about an hour. We'll be back with full coverage. Our coverage right now continues online.